Hi, I'm Doug Keck, and welcome to the all-new Catholic Sphere, where each week we continue to tackle topics important to Catholics around the globe. What's new is that each week the program will now feature a different host and a different focus. This week, our subject is theology. The topic, where have all the Catholics gone? To help us answer that question, we welcome our distinguished panel of experts. They are Father Chris Alar, host of Living Divine Mercy, and he's the director of the Association of Marian Helpers in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Our own Colin Donovan, vice president of theology here at EWTN in Irondale, Alabama, and my good friend Father Robert Spitzer, host of Father Spitzer's Universe, joining us from our studios in Orange County, California. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you for making the time for this program.
It's an honor.
Welcome, Doug.
Thank you.
So let's start off with the idea that there seems to be an impression, panel, that, attendance for Mass is down. In fact, there's a Barna research out that indicates that in-person church attendance is roughly 30 to 50% lower than it was before the pandemic. And among Catholics, 26% attend in person at least weekly now, compared with 30 in 2019. So that's kind of the topic we want to address. Let's start with you, Father Chris, if we can. Give us your top line reason why you think this is occurring, if in fact you do think it's happening.
Yeah, and thank you, Doug. It's not just that they're not in the churches, they're actually abandoning their faith. 10 years ago, almost 80% of U.S. adults identified themselves as Christians. Today, that's barely over 60%. Yet at the same time, the nuns, or atheists, agnostics, and nothings, have increased to 26% of the population. And so what we're seeing is the not only just not attending church, but not even the belief now. And I think the reason, to answer your question, is we've forgotten who we are and what we're called to do as church. Father James Mallon points this out very well in his book, Divine Restoration. And, we've lost that understanding of why we exist as a church to begin with. Many parishes, he points out, are crippled by a culture of maintenance, focusing on meeting just the practical needs of the parishioners, but yet failing to maintain an understanding of the mission. And what is our mission? Our mission is given by Christ, the Great Commission, to go, to be evangelizers, to go out, to baptize, to teach the commandments, to live it. And so we have a situation where we're not reaching out to the unchurched anymore. We're staying in our own bunkers, and this has become a problem. And as the book says, we need to be more mission rather than maintenance. And I think this is important.
Okay, very good. Colin, to you, what about your take on the present situation?
Well, I think Father hit the right point there in terms of the faith. As people have lost faith in institutions, they've lost faith in the teaching of the church. And part of that is the onslaught of our age. You look at the materialism, you look at the rebellion against authority, which of course goes back very far in the West, and in both of those things, the materialism certainly. And so we're sort of seeing all these polluted streams run together in our own time. And when that is compounded by the pandemic and the need to get back to the social order, frankly, the church, unless you have faith in the institution of the church, as Father said, and the mission of the church, there's not much to allure you back to the pews. And I think it's the idea of rebuilding the faith that people have in the church, in the Eucharist, as the Bishops' Conference will try to do with its Eucharistic document that they're working on. And to see that this is at the long historical pathway with so many elements and facets to it, that in that sense, it's beyond the merely human to resolve. And it's going to require that we depend a good deal on God and what He can do to draw people back in their hearts so that what the church presents to them is meaningful and attractive.
We turn now to Orange County and Father Spitzer. Your take.
Sure. I'm going to focus on young people. I think we're losing about 42% of our young people. These are church-going Catholic kids. by the time they reach about 24, 25 years old, 42% of them are going to leave. We know from the Pew surveys from 2012, 2016, et cetera, we know why 50% of that 42% will leave, and that is a perceived conflict between faith and science and a perceived lack of evidence for God, evidence for Jesus that is rational, acceptable to the culture around them. So we've got a huge, what I might call evidence or confidence problem. The irony is that we have more than enough evidence today than we've ever had before to support God, to support the transcendent soul, to support Jesus, you know, as not only real but risen. So the evidence is just, you know, over the top, and the evidence, particularly from science, is over the top. So much so that right now, overall, 51% of scientists are theists. They're believers in God. But among young scientists, the 40 and below group, 66% are believers in God. Now, there's got to be a reason for that. These are very intelligent people. They're rational people. They're looking for evidence. They've got evidence, and that's the problem. How do we get that evidence? I work in a place called the Maggia Center. We try to give evidence for God, for the soul, for Jesus, from reason, from science, very validated evidence to students. And we know that when we give the kids that evidence, they do maintain their faith, indeed defend their faith using that evidence. So we've really got to get it into the schools, starting in the middle school. 13's the age they'd start leaving. And then we got to get to the high schools, to the universities. And we have to just get Catholic teachers to see this is really, really important. Get it into the confirmation classes before they leave catechism, and let them know this is really important. Apologetics has to be restarted.
Right. Good point. Also, one of the things that struck me, there was an article and it was a comment made, and I wanted to start with you, Father Chris, after I read this and get each of your take on this. A particular priest said, if there's not an obligation or a pressure driving them, if there's no social pressure again, how are they going to form the habit again of going to church? The answer is is for us to focus on the love relationship with God, which is what we should be focusing on. Now, let me ask you a question, because he's making the point that if there's no obligation pressure. Now, most of us who grew up in my time frame always had an obligation pressure. Our understanding was our responsibility to go to church. Why has that been lost on today's cultural Catholic? Father Chris.
You know, it's a great point, backing to what Father Spitzer said, and that is, sometimes we're too smart for our own good. If we cannot prove empirically that God exists, how about giving a personal experience? You know, I've always taught the truth and the faith of the Catholic religion and why we have the fullness of the truth. And yet I have to admit there's something the Protestants are doing better than us. And that seems to be, we don't seem as Catholics to have that experience of a personal, profound encounter with Jesus that they seem to have, that they seem to find in other churches. This encounter has to come about through a charismatic, not just charismatic, but charismatic proclamation, going out and preaching, living, teaching the Gospels as the apostles did. That's how they changed the world. And then they become personal witnesses. They become evangelizers just in the way they live their life. This is what leads to personal conversion and to a change in life. This is what I think we Catholics, we go, we say our prayer, if that, we fulfill our Sunday obligation, if that. But what's going to draw more is pulling them, not pushing them by an obligation, pulling them to say, hey, there's joy, there's something here in the sacraments. In the Catholic Church, we've not encountered the presence of a meaningful community. You know, Doug, I've read many times the complaint with the Catholic Church is, I don't feel hospitable treatment. I don't feel welcomed. And in our Protestant brethren, they feel accepted. They feel more valued. And so holy hospitality is going to bring, I feel, a lot more back, having that involvement as community, because Where we do have better than the Protestants is it's not just about me and Jesus. It's about me, Jesus, and you. And so this is what we have to foster that community, communio, not just the individual.
Right, and following up on that column, the idea, obviously, there's a difference on one level in the Catholic worship because you're talking about the real presence being there as opposed to, let's say, most Protestant denominations where that's not involved. And so their concerns to some degree is that too many of their people are going to be happy to watch at home and they don't have to participate directly. But as a Catholic, you really need to be there. And is part of the allure, or shouldn't part of the call be, this is Jesus, he's really here, it's the only place you can meet him?
Yeah, I think so. That's a forgotten element of the theology of the Eucharist, that in a way, when the Protestant says, I have a personal encounter with Christ, the Catholic can say, you haven't had a personal encounter with Christ to the extent that I have. In other words, because we receive him body, blood, soul, and divinity, because we are members of his mystical body, the church, in a very concrete way in which we have a brotherhood and sisterhood of people around the world who have the same faith, and the same sacraments, and the same hierarchical structure, our encounter with Christ ought to be presented in ways that is much more attractive, and it certainly shows the reality of the truth of what the church is saying. Because I think very often, you know, we hear these conversion stories ourselves here at EWTN and in our programs of people, without the intervention of another human being, they come into the parish church, they're curious, and they know that there's something different there. The Lord can do that directly, but he also can do it through us. And I think the welcoming dimension that Father Alar mentioned is very important, because the church's highest reality, as Cardinal Ratzinger said, is a communio. And so by expressing our love and our communion and our fellowship with other people, it does relay that element of Christ and the mystical body as a redeemed people of the world. And we have to do a better job of that. We have to convince people. And on the flip side of that, we have to convince our own Catholics to stop fighting among themselves. Because, you know, the Lord prayed at the Last Supper that the apostles would all be one. We're not going to forward that, be that sign of unity when we're always bickering and fighting among ourselves. So I think that's an important element of it too. The factionalism in the church, the parties in the church, where it's always about my group of people and not about the church as a whole and the unity of the church. I think we've got to put those things more central and emphasize them more.
Well, that's a good point. I know myself, in understanding why there are all these different groups of religious. Why isn't there just one? It's because there's different spiritualities that are all appropriate inside the church, and Catholicism is neither this one or that one. It's always both and that's what we have to keep in mind. The real presence, we have it, but community should come with that as well. In fact, it should be a natural outgrowth of that experience, as you indicated, Colin. And Father Spitzer, one of the things that I know you've mentioned over the years when we've talked about issues related to the church, to some degree goes back to that idea of a kind of a lax attitude we see today in again, your obligation, the idea of going to church. I mean, many of us who grew up during the 70s would say, well, Sister said in my Catholic high school, if I don't get anything out of it, then I really don't have to go to church.
Yeah, it was an unfortunate turn of phrase, but here's the main point, I think. We still have to, as a church, fashion the need for why you should be going to church. And we have to do it in a very felt, explicit way. So in other words, maybe we can't just use the old thing of you better go to church or it's a mortal sin and you're going to hell. Now, you know, it might not work as well as it would have maybe in the past, but I do think we can start fashioning the need. I think we can do it on several levels where I think that need is felt poignantly. Number one, If you are not going to church, you can expect to find a skyrocketing increase in emptiness, alienation, loneliness, dread, and guilt in your life. And you know, people go around today. We know that the statistics are through the ceiling. Our young people have much higher rates of depression and anxiety and so forth than they ever did before. And it literally correlates with the loss of religion. So you see the anxiety levels, the emptiness levels, the depression levels are skyrocketing in direct proportion as the loss of faith begins to take place among these young people. So the first thing is we need to just be really explicit. You know, we're lonely without God. We are empty without God. We don't have absolute meaning without God. We don't have an absolute anchor without God. We don't have a sense of our eternity, our eternal destiny, and our eternal dignity without God. We don't have any of these things without God. And if you're not practicing, if you're not worshiping, if you're not there at church, if you're not receiving the Lord in Holy Communion, you can expect that you're going to feel all of these losses, this emptiness, alienation, loneliness, dread, and guilt. That's one thing. The second thing is we just don't say enough, and we should. And why we don't, I do not know. We should talk about the evil spirit. We just should. Because when we are not going to church, we open ourselves up truly to all of these seductions. People will say, oh, no, there's no such thing as an evil spirit. You know, I would just say there's plenty of evidence for that, and I would point out a few nice little exorcism diaries from a few priests that are now well-known public diaries, including that big old book, The Exorcist, by William Blatty, which was based on the exorcism in St. Louis of Robbie Mannheim, etc. But I would just say, oh, yes, there's certainly a devil. He's certainly real. He likes to keep hidden. Let's take up C.S. Lewis, even though it's a rather humorous and sort of funny book, but we should point that out. You are vulnerable to an evil spirit who can seduce you into choosing hell. You ought to be scared of that. Number three, the third thing is, you know, we've got all these things in our lives, every one of these things. And you know, the one thing that we can't afford to be is a bunch of ingrates. If we're ungrateful people, if we don't give God thanks for the creation of our immortal soul, for the redemption that has been wrought for us by Jesus Christ, if we're ingrates, then we're going to fall right into the old principle. I never knew a person who was unhappy and grateful. I never knew a person who was happy and ungrateful. We're going to fall right into that ressentiment, as you know, Nietzsche would call it. You know, our enemy calls it properly, correctly, that ressentiment that just basically sees the negative side of life, but doesn't, you know, in thanksgiving say to, you know, Lord, thank you for everything. Thank you for protecting me. Thank you for guiding me. Thank you for giving me my eternal soul. Thank you for giving me my salvation. Thanks for redeeming me from the evil spirit. But I think we got to fashion the need for religion, the need for going to church in a much better, more profound, incisive, and poignant way than we have previously. We're just, you know, we act like our religion is superficial.
Right.
We're deep. We're totally deep. And we just don't even get to the surface of that great spiritual depth that protects us, helps us, and brings our whole, you know, affect alive in the Lord Jesus Christ.
Right. Turn to you, Father Chris. One of the notes you sent before the show, we kind of talked a little bit about some of the topics. You talked about the church, in a sense, is sinking and that we're in lifeboats now. And you also talk about the idea the church has become a house of pain because our church is sick. Is that why people aren't interested in coming, because they're afraid they're just going to get more pain?
Yeah, we're living in the society today that if it doesn't make you feel good, it is no good. And so people stay away. And piggybacking on what both of our two other guests stated, I think is important. First of all, Father Spitzer, what he described is basically our telos. Why were we created? We were created to know God, love Him, serve Him, and be happy with Him forever. And when we're not united with Him, we have that lack, that deficiency in our life. So he's pointed out, rightfully so, we need God. Now, here's the thing. A lot of my family and other members will say, well, but I find God at that non-denominational church, and I have found him. Now I go back to what Colin said, because it's very important. Yes, but your encounter is not to the depth. As Father Spitzer said, we have a depth. And how do we find that depth? Why is our encounter greater? It's the sacraments. What I have found that has helped young people, believe it or not, because they can be analytical minds really in a at working beautiful way, is the fact that what makes Catholics different. Now, you can't have 40,000 different truths. You can only have one truth. So which faith has it? Well, the very fact that what makes us different than any other church is the sacraments. And the sacraments are not symbols. Well, Father, I had communion at my church. It was grape juice and Wonder Bread. Yes, it was symbolic of something. It was not actual grace. And we can't forget, if there's one thing we memorize, try to remember, what is a sacrament? A sacrament is an inward sign. It's an effective sign of God's grace instituted by Christ and entrusted to the church, by which divine life is instilled in us. So bottom line, Doug, what I try to tell the youth is that there's something different, as Colin said. There's something different. It's something deeper, as Father Spitzer said, because what we have is actual grace. When you come to the sacrament of confession, you are guaranteed the grace. It's not, I hope I'm forgiven, maybe I'm forgiven, I wonder if I'm forgiven. You are guaranteed forgiveness, or Jesus is a liar. You know, John 20:23 or Matthew 18:18. Here's my last point on that. What you pointed out about the sickness of the church, a lot of it comes because we don't want to acknowledge that we're broken. When we acknowledge that we're broken, then we're open to God's mercy. The problem is many are not wanting to acknowledge that. It's sin makes them feel bad, or hearing that they're doing something wrong. They don't want to hear it, so they don't come. Not until we hear it and acknowledge it can then we face our misery. And I'll state this. Jesus told St. Faustina that the most important thing is that we recognize our brokenness, so then he can fill us with his mercy. Then we can be merciful to others. Others feel welcomed. It is the solution to the need of the church today.
So, Colin, let me ask you, you talked a little bit about the idea of the struggles and factions inside and what, you know, people are listening to and not listening to, even in the sense of mystics and others. Why don't you explain a little bit more why you think that's impacted those going to church?
We have people who are leaving for the reasons of the science and materialism, as Father Spitzer has said, and they don't find the church welcoming, as Father Lars said. But there are also those who leave the church because they believe the faith of the church, but there's something in the church which has turned them off. It might be the scandals, it might be the Pope or a bishop or a priest. It may be, you know, anybody in authority that they feel that it was a mistreatment on their part or of them or something they favored. And as a consequence of that, they are driven from the church. And very often they're looking for a spiritual assurance that they are in the right and that the church is wrong or the individual is wrong on this point. And we've certainly seen in the last 40 years in particular, a lot of private revelation and apparitions which claiming to speak for God, the Blessed Mother, and so on, that are leading people into these, I call it apocalypticism. In other words, it's sort of that henny penny attitude that there is no solution here, but at least now I've got the answer for what the problem is and who's at fault. What people need there is hope. And the sacraments are very key, as Father Lars said. The sacraments are at the root of giving us hope, because the graces that come through them, the increase of faith, hope, and charity, which are central to this whole thing, simply behind all of the issues in the church is ultimately my faith in God or lack thereof, my hope in God or lack thereof, my love of God and those whom he calls me to love, which is everybody, or lack thereof. And so to rebuild those, you need the sources of grace, the sacraments. And a lot of people are abandoning them for false solutions, even though they may still believe in the doctrines of the church, or the nature of the church, and so on. They're identifying other things as the solution to their problem. So that's a difficult one, and adhering to what the church teaches, adhering to the church's guidance in this area of private revelation, I think that's important, because I think in the coming years we will see more and more of this kind of error being propagated and false solutions.
Very good. And closing us out on this program is going to be Father Spitzer. What about the impact of just the secular society on people's belief that going to church is important?
Yeah, the secular society, of course, has gone skyrocketing with its value system. I'm just going to summarize briefly and say the secular society's value system is ego comparative. The church's view of meaning in life is contributive and transcendent. It's based on faith. It's based on gift of yourself. But if you're ego comparative, and let's face it, about 74% of the people in our culture really believe that if they are on top, they're going to be happy. Who's achieving more? Who's achieving less? Who's got more power? Who's got less power? Who's got more status? Who's got less status? Who's more intelligent? Who's less intelligent? Who got more athleticism? Who's less athletic? Who's more beautiful? Who's less beautiful? If they can win the contest, or at least win some aspects of the contest, if they can put on their new social media account that they really are a winner, that they went to this particular party, or they were seen with these people, or they went and did this very interesting thing, that they're a kind of a top, enviable, Vanity Fair type of person, right, then they're going to be happy. But they're not happy. This is the whole point. Because when you're into who's achieving more, who's achieving less, etc., what winds up happening is you're just completely besieged by fear of loss of esteem, fear of failure, inferiority one moment, superiority the next moment, jealousy on the one moment, ego rage, ego blame, self-pity, and the list goes on, but it all translates into depression and anxiety. And if we allow our kids to stay at what I call level 2 happiness, if we allow our kids to stay at the ego comparative identity rung, if we don't get them to see that faith and the grace of God will save them from this life of misery, if we don't get them to see that service of others and love of their neighbor in and through Jesus Christ, in and through God, if that's the replacement, that's the way out, that's the door out of misery. If we don't do a good job combating secular culture with the best life philosophy there is, and you get it right in the Catholic Church, right in our spirituality, right in the grace of the sacraments, as Father Alar was saying, if we don't do this, then we have failed miserably, because they will continue to just feed their Instagram accounts. They'll just continue to go after ego comparative
identity. And they will have
identity.
to join us, Father, next time when we're going to talk specifically about how to solve all these problems. Thank you so much, Father Spitzer. Also on our panel, Father Chris Alar, of course, and of course our good friend Colin Donovan. And we thank you so much for joining us here on this latest edition of The Catholic Sphere. I'm Doug Keck. Join us next time. Have a good day.